The crown was never meant for a girl who once ate scraps from a tavern floor. Seraphine didn't know that when she set it down on the obsidian table that morning, her hands steady even though her heart was shattering, she was making the one decision Cael Vanthor would never allow. Not in this lifetime, not in any other. But she didn't know that yet. What she knew was this: the whispers had grown louder. In the corridors, in the council chamber. Behind cupped hands and above goblets of wine, they said the same thing they'd been saying for 3 months. That the Alpha King had lost his mind. That the woman wearing his crown had no bloodline, no title, no pack to call her own. That a king who chose a stray over a dynasty deserved whatever fracture came next. Seraphine had survived worse than whispers. She'd survived winters without shelter, years without a name anyone cared to remember. And the kind of hunger that didn't just hollow your stomach, but carved out pieces of who you thought you were, until there was almost nothing left. Whispers should have been easy. They weren't. Because this time, the whispers weren't about her survival. They were about his. She stood in the private chamber above the great hall, the room where Kale kept maps spread across every surface, and war strategies pinned to the walls with iron nails. Dawn was barely a suggestion through the tall windows, pale gold bleeding through clouds that hadn't decided whether to storm or surrender. The crown sat on the table between a stack of territorial reports and an untouched plate of bread and dried fruit someone had left for her hours ago. It was beautiful, the crown, a circlet of dark silver woven to look like antlers and thorns, set with a single stone the color of deep water. It was lighter than it looked. She'd been surprised by that the first time Kale had placed it on her head, his hands so impossibly gentle for someone capable of tearing through enemies without breaking stride. She touched the stone once, cool under her fingertip. Then she pulled her hand back and turned toward the door. She'd written the letter already. It sat folded beneath the crown, sealed with plain wax because she'd never had a sigil of her own. 3 lines. That was all she could manage before her vision blurred and she had to stop. You deserve a queen who makes you stronger, not one who makes them question you. I am not the hill your kingdom should die on. Forgive me. The door was 12 steps away. She counted them because counting kept her breathing even, and breathing even kept the tears from falling. And if she cried now, she would lose every ounce of resolve she'd spent the entire sleepless night building. 7, 8, 9. The door opened before she reached it. Kale filled the frame the way he filled every space he entered, not just with his size, though he was tall enough that the firelight behind her had to stretch to find the top of his dark hair, but with the kind of presence that made the air itself feel heavier, denser. Like the room had to rearrange itself around him. His eyes found hers immediately. Gray like iron, like winter rivers, like the sky right before it broke open. She had spent months learning the language of those eyes, every shade and shift. And right now they were reading her with a precision that made her feel like an open book. She desperately wanted to slam shut. He was still wearing his council clothes, the dark tunic with silver threading at the collar, the leather bracers he hadn't bothered to remove. Which meant the emergency session had run late, which meant they'd been talking about her again. "You're awake early," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the voice of a man who commanded thousands but never shouted. Couldn't sleep? Not a lie. She hadn't closed her eyes for more than a few minutes all night. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. His gaze swept the room the way it always did, cataloging, assessing. It landed on the table, on the crown sitting alone in the center of it, on the letter beneath. The silence that followed was so complete Seraphine could hear the fire cracking in the hearth across the room. She could hear her own heartbeat punching against her ribs like it was trying to escape before the rest of her could. Kale didn't move. For a long moment he simply looked at the crown and the letter and then, slowly, back at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not anger. Something worse. Understanding. Seraphine. Just her name. But the way he said it, low and rough and careful, like he was holding something fragile between his teeth, made her chest cave in. Don't. She held up a hand. Please. I need you to just let me go. He crossed to the table in 3 strides, picked up the letter, broke the seal and read it in the time it took her to take 2 unsteady breaths. She watched his jaw tighten, watched the muscle in his cheek flex, watched his fingers close around the paper until it crumpled in his fist. You deserve a queen who makes you stronger, he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. He set the crushed letter down. You think you don't make me stronger? I think I make you a target. I am the Alpha King. I was a target long before you. Not from your own people. Her voice cracked on the last word and she hated it. Hated the way vulnerability always found the worst possible moments to surface. Kale, I heard what Lord Merrick said in council last week. I heard what they're planning. A formal challenge to your bonding claim based on bloodline purity laws that haven't been invoked in 200 years. And they're invoking them now because of me. Because you chose me. Before we continue, please take 2 seconds to like this video. It tells me you want more stories like this. I know what Merrick said. Kale's tone didn't change, but something behind it hardened. Steel wrapped in silk. I know what he's planning. I've known for weeks. Then you know I'm right. If I step aside, if you take a queen from one of the noble packs, the challenge disappears. The fracture heals. Your kingdom stays intact. And you? He turned to face her fully, and the raw intensity in his gaze pinned her where she stood. Where do you go, Seraphine? Back to the roads? Back to sleeping in doorways and fighting for scraps? Back to being no one? The words hit like stones thrown at glass. She flinched. Couldn't help it. He saw it, and something in his expression broke. He closed the distance between them in 2 steps, stopping close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off his body, could smell pine and leather and the faint metallic edge that clung to him after long council sessions, like even his scent carried the weight of decisions. I'm sorry, he said, quieter now. That was cruel. It was honest. It was neither. His hand came up, hovering near her face without touching, always giving her the choice, always waiting. You were never no one. You were the woman who walked into a blizzard to lead 3 lost children back to their village. You were the one who stood between a wounded merchant and a band of raiders with nothing but a rusted knife and a spine made of iron. You were the person who, when I found you half frozen in that northern pass, looked up at me with those eyes and told me, and I will never forget this, told me to move because I was blocking the path. A sound escaped her, half laugh, half sob. You were blocking the path. I was trying to save your life. I didn't ask you to. No. His fingers finally made contact, just the tips, brushing her jaw, tracing the line of it with a reverence that made her knees feel unreliable. You never ask anyone for anything. That's the problem, love. You'd rather disappear than be a burden, and you can't seem to understand that your absence would be the thing that destroys me. Not Merrick, not a challenge. You, walking out that door. That is the only thing I cannot survive. Her vision blurred. She blinked hard, felt the heat of tears she'd been holding back for hours finally spill down her cheeks. His thumb caught one, then the other. Gentle, so painfully gentle from hands that could crush bone. They'll tear your reign apart, she whispered. Let them try. Kale, let them try. Each word landed with the weight of a vow. He cupped her face in both hands, tilting it up so she had nowhere to look, but directly into those gray eyes that burned like forges. Do you think I built this kingdom on the approval of men like Merrick? Do you think I hold this throne because noble families granted me permission? I am Alpha because I fought for it, bled for it, nearly died for it. And I chose you, Seraphine, not because it was easy, not because it was strategic, because you are the only person in this entire world who has ever looked at me and seen something other than a weapon. She couldn't breathe. The air had gone thick and warm, and her heart was hammering so hard she was certain he could hear it. The first night you slept under this roof, he continued, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. You had a nightmare. You cried out and I came to your door and you told me through the wood that you were fine, that it was nothing, that you were sorry for disturbing me. And I stood on the other side of that door for an hour, Seraphine, 1 hour, because I couldn't walk away from the sound of you hurting. I didn't even know your name yet. I just knew that whatever was happening on the other side of that door mattered more to me than anything happening in the rest of this castle. A sob broke free. She pressed her hand over her mouth to contain it, and he pulled her forward, wrapping his arms around her so completely that the world outside his chest ceased to exist. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong, a rhythm that had become more familiar to her than her own over these months. His chin rested on top of her head. His hand spread wide across her back, holding her together. You are not replaceable, he said into her hair. You are not a political liability. You are my queen. And I will dismantle every law, every tradition, every ancient bloodline purity code they try to use against you. I will do it publicly. I will do it without apology. And if Merrick wants to challenge my claim, he can do it to my face in the Great Hall, and we will see how brave his convictions are when they're not hidden behind closed doors. She pulled back just enough to look up at him. Her face was wet, her eyes swollen, and she'd never felt less like a queen in her life. What if it's not enough? What if they don't accept it? Then they leave. This is not a negotiation. You are not a bargaining chip. You'd lose allies. I'd lose cowards. There's a difference. The morning light had shifted while they stood there, moving from pale gold to warm amber. It caught the edge of the crown still sitting on the table and made the deep water stone flash. Seraphine looked at it. Kale followed her gaze. He released her slowly, crossed to the table, and picked up the crown with both hands. When he turned back to her, his expression was something she'd never quite seen before. Fierce and tender at the same time. A man holding a crown like it was a promise. Come here, he said. She went. Not because he commanded it, though his voice carried that weight. Because her feet chose to move. Because every part of her that had spent the night building walls felt them crumbling, and what was left underneath, what was always underneath, was the simple, terrifying truth that she loved him. That leaving would not have been strength. It would have been the deepest act of self-destruction she'd ever committed, and she'd committed several. He placed the crown on her head. His fingers lingered, adjusting it slightly, tucking a strand of dark hair behind her ear. The metal settled against her temples, cool and familiar. His hands framed her face again, thumbs tracing her cheekbones, and he leaned down until his forehead rested against hers. Never, he said. Do you hear me? Never. She closed her eyes. Let the words sink through her like sunlight through deep water. Let it reach all the cold, frightened places inside her that had been screaming at her to run. What happens now? She asked. Now we go to council. Together. Merrick will be there. I'm counting on it. The great hall was full by the time they descended. Every seat at the long curved table was occupied. Lords and ladies from the 6 allied packs, military commanders, trade advisors, the old keeper of laws who had served 3 kings before Kale and looked like she might outlast 3 more. Torches burned in their iron brackets along the walls, and the massive hearth at the far end of the hall threw wavering heat across the stone floor. Seraphine felt every pair of eyes land on her as she entered at Kale's side, the crown on her head, his hand at the small of her back. Not possessive, present. A point of contact that said, I am here, and so is she. And this is how it will be. Lord Merrick sat near the head of the table. He was a lean man with silver at his temples and the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. His pack controlled the eastern trade routes, and he wielded that leverage like a blade, carefully and always angled at someone's throat. Your Majesty. Merrick stood and inclined his head. His gaze slid to Seraphine and the smile thinned. And our queen. How lovely. Kale pulled out Seraphine's chair before taking his own. The room settled into tense quiet. I've called this session, Kale began, his voice carrying without effort, because it's come to my attention that certain members of this council have been pursuing a formal challenge to the Queen's position under ancestral bloodline purity statutes. I want to address this directly. Murmurs rippled through the table. Merrick's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked pleased that the matter was being raised. The statutes in question, Kale continued, haven't been invoked in over 2 centuries. They were written during an era when pack alliances were sealed exclusively through arranged matings between noble bloodlines. An era, I will remind this council, that also endorsed the culling of packless wolves, the branding of omegas, and the execution of anyone who challenged a sitting alpha's decision. He paused and let that land. We abandoned those practices because they were barbaric. The bloodline purity statutes were part of the same framework. They are relics, and I will not allow relics to be weaponized against my queen. With respect, Your Majesty. Merrick's voice was smooth as polished stone. The statutes exist for a reason. The strength of the crown depends on the strength of the bloodline. An Alpha King's mate sets the genetic foundation for the next generation of leadership. Surely you understand the concern. I understand it perfectly. Kale leaned back in his chair. To anyone watching, he looked relaxed. But Seraphine, sitting close enough to see the tension in his hands beneath the table, knew better. He was coiled, controlled. A predator deciding how much warning to give before the strike. What I find curious, Merrick, is that you didn't raise these concerns when I took the throne. You didn't invoke bloodline purity when I consolidated the 6 packs under one banner. You didn't question the strength of my bloodline when I ended the border wars that had been bleeding your trade routes dry for a decade. Your concern for genetic foundation seems remarkably selective. Color crept up Merrick's neck. The situations are hardly comparable. You're right, they're not. Because in every case where my decisions benefited you, my judgment was beyond question. It's only now that my personal choice inconveniences your political ambitions that suddenly ancient law becomes relevant. Silence. Heavy. Electric. The old keeper of laws cleared her throat. Her name was Dorath, and she had eyes like a hawk and a voice like gravel. If I may, I have reviewed the statutes Lord Merrick referenced. They do exist in the legal record. However, they require a unanimous council vote to invoke, and they also contain a clause that many seem to have overlooked. She produced a scroll from her robes and unrolled it with the care of someone handling something ancient and fragile. Article 7, subsection 3, should the Alpha's chosen mate demonstrate service, sacrifice, or merit of exceptional nature to the benefit of pack or kingdom, bloodline requirements may be waived by the Alpha's sole authority. This clause has never been repealed. Merrick's jaw tightened. Exceptional merit is subjective. Then allow me to remove the subjectivity. Kale stood. The room straightened with him. 3 months ago, during the northern border breach, when Fenris raiders crossed the mountain pass and reached the outer villages before our patrols could respond, it was Seraphine who organized the evacuation of 200 civilians, including the families of several people sitting at this table. She did it without soldiers, without orders, without anyone asking her to. She walked into danger because people needed help, and she knew how to give it. He looked at Seraphine. She looked at her hands. 6 weeks ago, when the supply chain from the eastern routes was sabotaged, and we later discovered the sabotage originated from within this council. His gaze moved to Merrick and stayed there. It was Seraphine who identified the discrepancy in the trade ledgers, because she'd been reviewing them, because she wanted to understand how this kingdom worked so she could serve it better. Merrick's composure cracked. Just slightly. A flicker of something cold and afraid behind the composed mask. "You want to challenge her position?" Kale said. "Fine, put it to a vote, but know this. Every person in this room who votes against my queen votes against me. And I have a long memory, my lords, a very long memory." The vote was called. 17 seats at the table, 15 voted to dismiss the challenge. 1 abstained. Merrick voted against. He was the only one. Afterward, in the corridor outside the great hall, Seraphine leaned against the stone wall and let out a breath. She felt like she'd been holding for months. The torchlight flickered across her face, and the crown felt different on her head now. Not lighter, but steadier, like it had decided to stay. Kale appeared beside her. He didn't lean against the wall. He stood with his arms crossed, looking at her with an expression that was too soft for a king and too fierce for anything else. "You reviewed the trade ledgers?" he said. "They were on your desk. I was curious." "You're always curious. Is that a complaint?" "It's the furthest thing from a complaint." He uncrossed his arms and reached for her hand. His fingers wove through hers, warm and certain. "You know what Merrick will do now. He'll try again. Differently. He'll try. He won't succeed. You can't know that." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. Slow. Deliberate. The kind of gesture that should have felt antiquated, but instead felt like the most honest thing she'd ever experienced. "I know that I have spent my entire life being underestimated," he said against her skin. "And I know that you have spent yours being overlooked. We are not an easy pair to defeat, Seraphine. We know every trick because every trick has been used against us." She turned her hand in his and cupped his jaw. Rough with stubble. Warm. Alive. He closed his eyes at her touch, and in that brief, unguarded moment, the Alpha King looked like nothing more than a man who was terrified of losing the only person who'd ever made him feel safe. "I'm sorry I tried to leave," she whispered. "Don't be sorry. Just don't do it again." "Is that a royal command?" His eyes opened, gray and burning. "It's a request. From the man who loves you more than he has ever loved anything in his life, and that includes this kingdom, which I would burn to the ground before I let it take you from me." She kissed him, rose up on her toes and pressed her mouth to his, and felt his surprise last exactly half a second before his hands were in her hair, and he was kissing her back, with the kind of intensity that left no room for doubt, for fear, for whispers. The stone wall was cold against her back, and his body was warm against her front, and the crown tipped slightly, and neither of them cared. When they finally pulled apart, breathing hard, foreheads together, he laughed, low and quiet and slightly stunned, the way he always laughed after she kissed him first, like he still couldn't quite believe she chose to. "For the record," he murmured, "if you ever put that crown on a table again, I will personally weld it to your head." That sounds uncomfortable. Less uncomfortable than watching you try to give away the only title you've ever deserved. 2 months later, the eastern trade routes had been restructured under new oversight. Lord Merrick had been reassigned to a diplomatic post in the far north. Technically an honor, practically an exile, where his political maneuvering could do limited damage, and the cold might cool his ambitions. The bloodline purity statutes had been formally repealed by unanimous council vote. the first major legal reform of Cael's reign, with Seraphine's name on the proposal. The castle was quieter now, not the tense quiet of people holding their breath, but the settled quiet of a house that had weathered a storm and found its walls still standing. Seraphine sat in the private chamber above the great hall, the same room where she'd once placed a crown on a table and tried to walk away. The maps were still spread everywhere. The war strategies were still pinned to the walls. But now there was a second chair at the desk, a smaller one with a cushion that Kale had carried up the stairs himself one afternoon without comment, and a stack of trade ledgers that were undeniably hers. The door opened. Kale entered carrying 2 cups of something steaming. He set one in front of her and dropped into his own chair with the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent 4 hours mediating a territorial dispute between 2 packs who disagreed about the placement of a fence. "A fence," he said, as if she'd asked. 4 hours. Over a fence. Was it a nice fence? He looked at her. She looked at him. His mouth twitched. Then hers. Then they were both laughing. The kind of laughter that comes from shared absurdity and deep comfort. And Seraphine thought, not for the first time, that this was what she'd almost given up. Not the crown, not the title. This. A man who brought her tea without being asked and argued about fences and kissed her knuckles like they were sacred and stood in front of an entire council and said, "Never." He reached across the desk and adjusted her crown, which had tilted the way it always did when she spent too long bent over documents. "Still here," she said. "The crown, or you?" "Both." His hand lingered on her cheek. His thumb traced the line beneath her eye, the same path her tears had taken that morning 2 months ago. His expression was the one she loved most, not the king's face, not the alpha's face, just Kale. Unguarded. Hers. "Both," he agreed. "Always." Outside the window, the sun was setting over the kingdom, gold and copper and deep, deep blue, like the stone in her crown, like the color of a future she was only just learning to believe in. She leaned into his hand. He let her stay. "Thank you so much for listening to my story. Where are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. I love hearing your thoughts. And if you'd like to support me, please subscribe. It's free, and it helps more people hear these stories.